50, 100 years, because they're constantly debating about what works or doesn't.
So here's my question. So with string theory, I mean, I read The Elegant Universe a long time ago, and that was back probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, that it was becoming popular. I like the elegance of string as vibration. Like, that's the way I conceive of it, right? It's like, everything is vibration, everything is frequency. So I haven't followed, like, I don't know what the debates are currently in academia. I mean, I'm very interested by the plasma physics, for example, and the electric universe concept. Right. I'm very familiar with that, which to me just makes a lot more sense than the Big Bang, even, because the electric universe basically is saying that there is no Big Bang. It's just there's not even inflation in terms of the cosmology, right? Like, that's an illusion that everything is getting farther and farther away from each other, which actually makes sense to me. It's like, the Big Bang is a sexual action, right? It's essentially it's semen and the egg, and there's a spark of life. Boom, the universe is formed now, or the computer is booted. That's one conception of it. Or it's just this how do you say? There might be some level of inflation and contraction. I'm not sure, but overall, it's like the notion of the electric universe is more about the idea that there's no beginning and no end, right? And that, again, that makes more sense to me than trying to understand, well, if this Big Bang came from this extremely charged, moment in the universe of, which really is just like compressed energy and heat into like this, into I don't even know how small a space, exploding. Well, where did that come from? Right.
Well, if I could tell you,
the Big Bang collapse, is that their theory? I mean, it just, to me, yeah, it's possible, I guess. But so is the electric universe theory.
You and I say this purely complimentary and in a positive way, you would be a very big threat if you got involved in the academic world. Because in my opinion, you're very, very warm. And I say this in a plethora of ways. Like, for example, a lot of people don't realize that the equation for an RLC circuit, which stands for resistance, inductance, capacitance, is very similar to the equation for the speed of light. It's interesting that anytime an electrical engineer, or even an electronics engineer for that matter, even a ceramics engineer tries to get involved in the UFO UAP topic, they immediately get shunned away by physicists or theoretical physicists, almost as if there may be certain elements that are missing that, when implemented, describes a fluid description of everything, like what you had said. So it's interesting to see that, but I know we're coming close to the end here. Before we look at some of the some new DoD slides that I'd love to get your perfect. Yeah, I did want to ask one last thing, if it's all right, and respectfully, if it's something you feel you can speak on. Excuse me. People like, of course, yourself, but even people like your father who have been around for many decades with respects to really pushing the envelope with many documentaries, whether it's the Putin interviews, which I'm a big fan of, in which it was unfortunate to see it get nixed from the Crave, hosting platform after the whole, Ukraine thing started. How and recently your father was on Lex Friedman talking about, please correct me if I'm wrong, a documentary he recently did going to various laboratories and under the Department of Energy in the US. And he seemed to realize that with data to back it, that a lot of what's been called stigma and things that scientifically wouldn't work, in fact, do work. They just have not been scaled up for political reasons. So I guess my question is, how does someone like your father, with a genuine sincerity, how does he not get, for example, attacked, whether in the press or things like this, whether it's even with the JFK files that he's worked on very extensively? How does he not, for example, get pushback like others do, for example? And I say that very respectfully, just curious as to how perhaps that would work in a certain regard.
Yeah, I mean, he has gotten pushback. The thing is that, he was in a position in '91 when he made JFK that he won 3 Academy Awards at that time. So, I mean, basically he's at the top of, of the Hollywood not establishment, but let's say like the Hollywood pedigree. You can't really get, more acclaim and acknowledgement from your peers at that time, or at any time, just in terms of the Academy. I mean, nowadays, I don't know if the Academy Awards have the same value because we've shifted into a place where, you've got to have 50% diversity or something. You can't get nominated if there's not 50% diversity in the film and on the set. I mean, it's just crazy. It's crazy, like what's going on as far as the manipulation. I mean, I'm all for diversity. I don't think you have to force it. I think that's just natural. It's like the debate again about affirmative action. It's like these things will naturally occur. You don't need to force quotas and stuff. It becomes tokenism to me. It becomes silly. It's like you lessen the value of it because you're just looking at it like, oh, this is forced as opposed to organic. So as far as 91 when he made JFK, it's like he's coming off of Academy Awards and huge success with box office success with his Platoon and won the 4th of July, and some iconic films like Scarface and Wall Street and all. So it's like he's already been, and Salvador also. He's already been the anti-establishment director. Like that's what he's known for at the time. Platoon, was basically showing the horrors of Vietnam, and not My Lai, but something similar. They showed some of the atrocities. Salvador shows the corruption of the U.S. government's involvement in Latin America, the CIA backing death squads down there, and assassinating the Archbishop. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that obviously has gone on, and he's exposing these things in his film. So when he made JFK, it was a leap in the sense of, wow, he's showing the Kennedy assassination through the lens of conspiracy theory, and not necessarily telling you who did it, but giving you a plausible theory as to the why Kennedy was killed. Didn't go into all the whys. I think there's the financial components as well that are really important. The U.S. Kennedy trying to shift us to the Treasury to issue currency from the Treasury as opposed to from the Fed. But there's there's like a conspiracy theory movie that's mainstream that's being seen by millions of people. You don't just take someone out. You criticize them. You attack them. The media really went after him. They put his first early drafts of the script. They basically tore them apart. People hadn't even seen the movie and they're already criticizing the script. So imagine this was a total, campaign that was being run by the mainstream media, probably under, again, was it Mockingbird, CIA influence, Council on Foreign Relations. I mean, all these things are, again, they're still part of the same mind. It's not, conspiracies are in the mind level. That's what people oftentimes don't get. They think, oh, there's no document to prove it. Well, sometimes there's documents. Most of the time it's mind, it's conversation, it's a way of viewing the world. It's a worldview. And so when your worldview says, the establishment cannot allow people to question the government's report on Kennedy's assassination, or that more than one person was involved in it, their government elements and mafia elements working together, to assassinate him. Because if people know that, then that means what else can the government be doing? Who else can it be killing? How bad can it really get if it can, if government personnel and elements could basically be involved in killing the president of the United States in a coup d'etat? What does that mean about your government? You see? And so that's why it had to be repressed to this day. It can never be acknowledged that it's insane to think Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. The mainstream media will never allow that to be, established as truth, that he did not kill him, that he did not kill Kennedy or act alone. And so my father was attacked and thereafter called a conspiracy theorist. And so he was allowed to obviously continue making movies and documentaries. But of course it affects, him, because you don't know how people, Snowden, for example, his film Snowden, it wasn't distributed by like mainstream studios. It was, done independently. It was released, I think, I can't remember which distribution company ultimately picked it up, but it wasn't like a major like Warner Brothers deal, and so, a lot of these things they're more nuanced. They don't go out there and just like kill everyone. I mean, that's not how these things are done, unless you're really threatening. And obviously we've seen that, we've seen a lot of doctors, what do they call it? Like holistic doctors that died, in the last few years, I think a few hundred. And, those are mysterious deaths. And those, each one you have to look at. Were they curing cancer? Were they doing things that are really challenging to the establishment, and viably so? Whereas if you're in a media position, what they tend to do is they discredit or they acknowledge and say, well, you're a great director, but we're going to kind of not push even nuclear right now. It doesn't have distribution. So that's what they would do. It's like the mainstream media, the mainstream control apparatus can acknowledge and appreciate people and still make it hard for you to get your film out to the public.
Right. And I gotta say, man, when I see the way that even including yourself, the way that you and your father produced your documentaries and all of that, it does have the top of the top quality, as if, for example, some big studio were to pick it up and distribute it, you name it. It's not like there's a lack of quality whatsoever, which is why, perhaps, forgive me for not maybe doing my homework as much as I should have when I had said, for example, how is it that this quality is so fantastic and it can be distributed everywhere? For example, like the Snowden film. I mean, that was pretty freaking damning, for lack of a better term. And even the I really do wish that a lot of people had watched, a lot more people, albeit there were millions, as I understand it, had watched the Putin interviews, because it's not, as you and your father say, it's not about justifying, it's about rationalizing and trying to understand every angle.
Well, I'll give you a really interesting tidbit. I was talking to a guy working with military intelligence here in Florida, and he actually was the one that told me. He goes, he told me about adrenochrome. This was, after it, became public knowledge in 2020. Really, people started talking more about it. And he said, the first time he heard about adrenochrome, he said, was on intercepts for trafficking. He goes, I had never heard of adrenochrome except from traffickers talking about adrenochrome. And he's like, that's why I know it's real, because they're using it, they're trafficking this stuff. So he then we're talking about the Putin interviews, and he says, basically that's our go-to, or at least it was at that time, a few years ago, for understanding Putin. He says, because we don't have any outreach to this government, really. There's no communication. It's especially since 2016. I mean, well, since 2012 it really shifted. Remember, like, Hillary and company were trying to make sure Putin didn't win the election in 2012, and from 2012 forward, basically, it was a very clear anti-Putin agenda in Washington. But yeah, the military intel guys, like, this is probably one of our best resources for understanding Putin is this Putin interviews.
To your point, man, I've watched that series over and over and over again, because it's not, and again, I'm not trying to say that, Putin is not for lack of a better term, a gangster, criminal, you name it. I mean, again, I'm not saying in either direction, although one can make a very strong case about, various elements of the United States government as well, for that matter, right? So with that said, though, it's like when Putin had said to your father, he would like to see, I'm paraphrasing here, a balance, a multi-power balance in the world. That was something personally, again, in that particular context, I fully agree. When this idea that why does there have to be one, king sitting on the throne overseeing the rest, when in fact 2, 3, 4 superpowers can sort of keep each other in check, if you will, so that it benefits the people, if that makes sense.
What I believe happened with the Ukraine war is a shift to multipolarity. Basically, it was, to me, I've said this, for months now. To me, this is the end of the one world government, new world order, unipolar state, basically, that we've been seeing since the fall of the Soviets in 1991, right? And Putin, look, we can argue about his specific policies. Have they assassinated people? Sure. Do we assassinate people? Of course. I mean, it's like, come on, like, we're not going to sit here and go, which state assassinates more people. I mean, Russia's got serious problems historically. Strong, it's had authoritarianism for 1,000 years, right? This is not like Putin is an aberration from Russian politics. He's a continuation of Russian politics, and I don't think he's alone. I think that there's a power structure in Russia, just like there is power structure here, right? So, we can't be entirely clear as to how things work in Russia, but he has brought Russia back from a collapse. In the 90s, Russia was a collapsed economy. It had been looted economically. It was, people were standing in lines for food. There was huge. I remember the HIV was decimating the population, drug abuse, in the 90s, it was collapsing population. Basically, if you looked at the population growth, it was basically stagnant, if not collapsing. It was in terrible condition.
Yeah.
Putin basically has been at the helm of a revitalized Russia. Whether people want to acknowledge that or not, doesn't matter. It's true. You look at Moscow, a few years ago when I visited, it's a modern city. It's got solid infrastructure. It was ranked before the war as one of the top cities in the world.
A lot of historical elements too, right?
Well, historically, I mean, St. Petersburg and Moscow obviously are tremendous historically. I'm saying, but they've modernized, right? They're not. Right. These are not third world country. It's not a third world country anymore. And the ruble, since the Ukraine war, has only strengthened. Russia shifted to a gold-backed system, if I'm correct, and they're accepting gold now for their oil, which is a huge shift. I think we're going to see the same thing ultimately coming to America. To basically, the only way we're going to be able to stabilize the economy here, our monetary system here, is with gold. So Russia basically has made this break from the West, and people are saying, "Oh, Russia's collapsing." It's like, that's nonsense. The evidence doesn't show Russia collapsing. The economy seems to be fine. There's a shift now. Again, there's the rest of the world that they can deal with, and the rest of the world is not Western Europe and America, right? It's, you name it. It's Africa and Middle East and Asia and South America. There are many countries that are happy to buy Russian oil and deal with the Russians. So Russia, China, the BRICS. Remember, this was 2014 time period, roughly. The BRICS were established, and it was like, we understood even then, we are shifting away from the unipolar petrodollar world, which is all we have. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have tremendous mines, we have technologies, but we've been exporting dollars because the rest of the world needed them to buy oil. As it seems now, the rest of the world is shifting to no longer need dollars to buy oil, to be able to, use gold or yuans or rubles or other things to buy oil. It changes the nature of the game. So we're going to see, again, this coming time period, a huge rebalancing of the world economy, and hopefully it will be a positive thing for America, because we've got to get our house in order. We've got 300 plus million people, and we've got too many people packed into cities like LA and New York, and whatever, in a few cities, and you've got decimation in so many of the Rust Belt, cities, and our, how do you say, like our productive industry. You've got young people who are dying from suicide and depression and fentanyl and all the, and oxy and all these different, opioids and other things, because they're depressed. They don't know what to do with themselves. You have this, huge population that doesn't have a trajectory to put their energy into, to say, yeah, we're going to, where are the technologies to basically to build a brighter future, to build new cities where where there's been collapse and decay. And not again, this is a go back to what we talked about at the beginning, not just, okay, the matrix has to continue itself and we're just going to pump more money into this facade. But like, no, what is the actual vision for the future look like? How can we have a more holistic relationship with nature, with technology, with ourselves? And the experiential economy is key to all this, right? Because that's what people are buying now. And it's funny because the galactic historian Andrew Bartzius told me this a few years ago. He's like, in the universe, in the cosmos, experience is wealth, which is true, right? If you could download someone's consciousness, I mean, isn't that what we're here for? We're here to have experiences, right? I'm here to live, to see things, to touch things, to experience things, to, feel emotions. Going back to your thing about, think less and feel more. Like, we're here for feeling. So a lot of the future economics is going to be around exchanging feelings, because that's really where we're going anyway with all these things, whether it's listening to someone's podcast or watching movies, TV shows, buying people's Patreons, or, whatever it may be, right? It's all about experience. I want that experience. I want to share that experience. So this is the experiential economy, which knows no bounds, because ultimately, what is the limit of experience? There is none. Right? That's why we've been around for thousands of years. Obviously we're here for an experience. And that's why we keep having children, because we want them to have experience of this earth. If we didn't want them to experience this earth, we wouldn't be having kids. So there's something that's very magical, that's very beautiful, that we're all in this for. And I think the economy of experience, you cannot discount how much, this will basically be what carries us in this coming decade. And the metaverse is a part of that, and there's going to be dimensional experiences and all this. So I'm very excited about where we're going. My biggest concern as far as where we're going is just that there is a dark faction that has been terraforming this planet against human life for potentially for 100 years, but definitely the last few decades. It's gotten insane. The spraying of heavy metals, toxins, right? The GMOs, the replacement basically of organic foods with inorganic foods, the pesticides and herbicides that are getting into our food chains and our water supplies. All this is this is what scares me, because I trust that nature can ultimately rectify it, but it will take time. And how much will this poisoning continue before people wake up and realize this is not what we need for our lived experience of this planet? We don't need a more inorganic experience, but this inorganic experience of the heavy metals and all that seems to me to be driven by an overall agenda. And I think, people like Alana Freeland talk about it much better than I do. People should read her book, Bioengineered Transhumanism, but it's a transhumanist future. It's basically terraforming the planet for robotics, for Internet of Things, for everything to be connected at the nanotech level, and basically to infiltrate the human body at the nanotech level.
In a non-organic manner, perhaps.
Exactly, to make us more inorganic, to make us more controllable at the level of biology, psychology, you name it, to basically put us into a position where we have to, in order to survive, because they've so manipulated our environments that we're basically living in toxicity, and we can't survive without basically accepting the robotic future, basically accepting their upgrades, whatever it may be, their gene therapies, right? Their mRNA techs, their chips, whatever it may be, to basically say, well, you can no longer survive in this inorganic world because you're organic bodies, so you have to accept our technology and bring it into your being and bring it into your household. And you can't survive with all this, 5G toxicity around you, so you have to basically do whatever it may be, take this supplement, take this, this injection. That's what I'm concerned.
Well, first off, before we get into the slides, I did want to bring up something that, had I not watched your father's documentary regarding Putin and all of this, going back to this concept of what you were discussing regarding control, there was a particular scene when your father was asking Mr. Putin, basically saying, talking about how it seems as though there's this large train-like path of trucks going into Turkey, bringing in, it seemed like a bunch of oil, if I'm not mistaken. And essentially, it seemed almost as if, they were just being these alleged, I believe ISIS elements that were helping the oil get into Turkey, were just coming right through the border like nothing. And so your father asked Mr. Putin, basically saying, could you not say, Mr. Erdogan, Mr. President, behind the scenes, we have good information that, this is coming across your border into your country, and we're very concerned. And then Putin starts laughing, not at your father, but as if to say, basically Putin's face, this is just my interpretation, I could be wrong, but Putin's face sort of said to your father and to the camera and the audience, like, you don't think they know? They're the ones letting it in. So this speaks to me about this idea, to your point of control. There seems to be this multiple layers, multi-layered, sort of like an onion, state of, I guess you could say, artificial awareness, and I'll give an example where, for example, politicians, whether it's representatives at the local level all the way to, the presidential level, regardless of party, they say one thing publicly, they say another thing privately, and then in an even more private setting, they say a totally other thing, and it just keeps going and going.
With politicians, I don't know who pulls their strings. There's so many different factors, right? I mean, there's there's the obvious, you have a corporate sponsorship and donors, but really I think the influence is largely at the level of secret societies, intelligence agencies, right? Compromise, because most of these guys, if not all, that especially if they're in there for long periods of time, they're compromised. It's almost impossible to get into power for 30, 40 years.
Yep.
Serious deep state relationships and connections.
I completely agree. So without further ado, speaking of this, what we were talking about before with vortexes, plasmas, and dispersing of energies. Excuse me. Let me just share my screen here, specifically to this particular slide right here. Just want to make sure you can see it. Okay. You could see it on your end, or?
Yes.
Okay, so what we're looking at here essentially is a plasma device that was essentially having to do with something called the Priore machine. It was an Italian, I believe, an inventor who worked under the government of France in France shortly after World War II. That was given essentially a steady financial grant in order to develop various sort of medical apparatuses. And I'm paraphrasing the story to make it a long story short, but he basically was curing with this device cancers of all kinds, not just on mice, but on humans. Now, what's interesting about the human side is that it's been claimed that many people were cured, but there's little to no documented proof of it, which has been alleged that the CIA stepped in and the French government took such documents and all that. But it speaks to this idea that he was going to put this on a moving car or a moving apparatus with wheels so that he could basically bring it anywhere he wanted to, and for lack of a better term, relieve extremely tremendously painful medical issues people were having just by shooting and dispersing this plasma, for lack of a better term, down the street of a neighborhood.
Wow. Okay.
So, I mean, do you see, with respects to various elements, whether publicly or behind the scenes, just in your opinion, whether physically or in a spiritual sense, do you see this type of technology perhaps resurging if real?
Oh, why not? I think that we have to, again, we have to move forward, and the decentralization of power is the only way to do it, because centralized authority figures, like the JP Morgans obviously will always suppress the Teslas, but if you decentralize power, then there is an opportunity.
All right, so we are going to now take a look at one final slide as well that I have not shown publicly before. This is alluding to the concept that, for example, the Gulf War syndrome, particularly in the first Gulf War, induced certain what we would call psychotronic frequencies. I don't mean to make leaps and bounds here, but some have hypothesized and postulated that perhaps some of this understanding of such frequencies may have had to do with the suppressed Tesla technology patents, not just that, but as well as the potential crossing over and application of some of this work into MK Ultra. And now it seemed as though this transitioned over based on the illusion or the alluding to from this slide and implication that basically this was practiced on a much more en masse level, if you will, outside of United States territory.
So wait, so what do you mean by Gulf War syndrome? Because my understanding of Gulf War syndrome is that it came from the anthrax shots. But what do you think is the cause?
It seems as though that whether it came from the anthrax shots or otherwise, there was some type of induced experimentation having to do with the manipulation of radio frequencies. Now, I don't know. I'm not claiming to know exactly what, but it seemed as though that there was some type of combination of the shots with a radio frequency. And I want to be very clear. I'm not, for the audience, I'm not speaking on COVID, just to discern the two.
But this is not new. I mean, this is not new, the radio frequency stuff. In fact, let me grab this book real quick, because
sure,
and you can keep talking about it, because the EMF thing is, how do you say, this has been known for decades, since the beginning of the creation of the radio waves and whatnot, that they can be carcinogenic. So go ahead, continue on that if you want.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So it speaks to this idea ultimately that if one could potentially allow for certain radio frequencies to quote unquote lock in with various other elements of what our ancestors may have called alchemical means, or other forms of, I guess you could say, various opposing frequencies, or even, as Randall Carlson said on Joe Rogan's show, resonant frequencies in combination with plasmas, plasmoids, things like this, gaseous states, if you will, of various kinds, it can induce a different effect than what normally would be studied in the laboratory, if that makes sense.
Well, of course, because what we're talking about a human being as an electric being. We're literally, we have electricity coursing through us. We generate our bodies are running through electricity. And so when you're affecting the electromagnetic fields, that surround us, all around us, right? I mean, this is what's so crazy, is that we've seemed to have totally forgotten. This is the book I was going to show you. This is a great book. It's called Hidden Dangers, 5G, but it's a military guy. Jerry Flynn wrote it. He was an electronic warfare specialist. And he just documents, the book is just basically documenting decades of studies and things, basically the military, basically denying that it's called like non-pulsed. There's some kind of something about non-pulsed. What's the word for it? Anyway, safe exposure. Basically the U.S. Navy and military basically set a safe exposure for microwave radiations, right? And microwave is part of this.
I know what you're talking about, because they would pulse it. They would pulse it, and then it would sort of ride the frequency like a surfer riding a wave, kind of, and then it would affect whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they call non-ionizing are basically ELFs all the way to infrared and the visible light spectrum. But microwaves, as we know, are dangerous. As a kid, I was always told, don't want to like stand around a microwave. Now, I would suggest getting rid of your microwave entirely, because it is pulsing. And basically, what we're talking about with like cell phones and others are in that same microwave range. And so here we are, like going from don't have the cell, don't put your head near a microwave, to having the cell phone at our ears, around us, on our persons at all times. And you're sitting here going, I don't think this is probably healthy. But it's dialogue.
To your point, it speaks to this idea of, we're told one thing, and then, a couple decades later, we're told to do the opposite of the thing we were told not to do. So Correct. It's like,
yeah, no, it's insane, because they count on the fact that people have no memory. That's what's always so curious to me. As I said earlier, it's not so much that I feel, that I'm an intelligent person. I tend to have memory and connect dots and see things like, intuitively as like patterns. And okay, I remember stuff that, I feel like a lot of just people kind of in one ear out the other, right? So I remember like 2 decades ago when people were talking, when it was being covered by the mainstream news, that, high fructose corn syrup was carcinogenic. And the only reason that it was being approved and pushed was because the U.S. government was subsidizing the farmers. And the farmers in America, are not the farmers, really. It's not farmers, it's big agriculture. That's where people have to remember. This is not like your, local farmer that's doing this, all this GMO crops. It's the big agriculture industry that's doing all this GMO stuff. And so they're mass producing corn, and the US government is subsidizing them to basically mass produce corn. And what do they do with this corn? Like, it's not like we just eat, we don't eat that much corn. They have to put it into something like high fructose corn syrup or canola oil, all this other crap, all made from GMO corns, all terrible for your body. And yet, fed to children, even though 2 decades ago, I remember being told like, it's not good for you. But here we are, still feeding it to the kids.
I couldn't agree more. And with that said, I think that's probably the best way to sort of wrap this up and call it a day on this. But before you do go, if you would like to let my audience know where and how you could be found, whether it's a website, I know you got a docu-series recently, your Patreon, you name it, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So the best places for me is always seanstone.info, my website. It's easy to use. You can subscribe there to my newsletter. You can, get links to Patreon, to my docuseries, Best Kept Secret, to all my documentaries, Hollywood DC, Metahuman, Singularity, my short film. I've done a bunch of documentaries, shorts, and features. So they're all linked there. And that's the best place to reach me and connect with me.
Awesome. Well, brother, thank you so very kindly from the bottom of my heart, and on behalf of as well my members and my audience as well, for coming on again. It was the first time around was extremely well received, and truly I can't thank you enough for your time, but also mainly for your perspectives on how you view things. I'm actually of the very humble opinion that everything you've been discussing and the perspectives you've taken have been far more sophisticated and advanced than the vast majority of, dare I say, many people in academia, not all, but many, with respects to you literally saying why can't something outside of the box be implemented into the system, or even create its own system.
Right. I mean, that's where we have to take things. If we actually, we have to work on making discoveries here. We can't just keep repeating the old. It's like, Einstein wasn't just sitting there going, well, let's just repeat what's been taught before. It's like, no, let's actually like look towards making valid discoveries about reality. Let's look at reality, and we can't ignore things. And that was honestly where Einstein's limitation was when it came to quantum physics. It was like he couldn't fathom how this could work in God's universe. Well, you may not understand how it works, but if it's there, let's look at it. Let's have the courage to say this may seem like an anomaly, but the anomaly can oftentimes give us the greatest clues into how reality actually works.
Couldn't have said it better myself, man. The speaking to the idea of the joy is in the journey. Movement is life. To your point of experiencing things, because once you experience one thing and that's over, not necessarily in a malevolent way, but a lot of people go, okay, what's next? And rightfully so. So, yeah, well, without further ado, thank you so very much again, man. And to my audience on my end, we'll catch you all very, very soon. Thank you so much, everybody.